Hello, and welcome to episode 143 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We are here today with Jen Pauliukonis, president of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, former legislative director for Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, and former Maryland chapter lead for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. Jen is also a former educator. Jen, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Excellent. The first question I'd like to pose to you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
So before the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School, I hadn't done much. I mean, I was a high school teacher, so of course, working in public education, I felt as though I was contributing to society at large. But mostly my politics, it was, complaining on social media and chatting with my friends and family. I really hadn't gotten involved aside from voting. And then after Sandy Hook happened, I sat around and I cried. And I realized that wasn't enough, that I was complicit in those shootings, because after Columbine happened and after Aurora happened, I hadn't gotten involved. And I live just outside of Baltimore City. Right. And what was I doing to help Baltimore City? What was I helping to do to prevent so many of the people in my own state and in my own area from being shot every day on the street?
So what is it particularly about the Sandy Hook incident that really galvanized you? As you mentioned, there have been mass shootings for a long time, relatively. Was it that the children who perished in Sandy Hook were of a similar age to your children? Is that what hit closer to home for you?
So I think that I saw that from two places. I saw it from the face of an educator, and I saw it from the face of a mother. I didn't have kids before. I think part of it is just how young those kids were. I mean, they were babies, and they were in an elementary school. And I think we try to rationalize gun violence. We try to say, oh, well, that's because someone's involved in crime, or well, that's just this neighborhood, or well, that's a college, but I'm sure it won't happen to a high school. And when it happens to a high school, and say, well, now we're normalizing it in a high school, but it could never happen to an elementary school.
So it hit like the most safe place possible. Absolutely. And the most vulnerable people possible.
Yes. And my son right now is in first grade. And, when he is, in his pajamas, I mean, he's just a baby. I mean, they were just babies. And to have educators who put themselves on the front line, who had to sacrifice themselves to try to save those kids.
You don't think of a school as a war zone where you have to sacrifice your life for your kids.
Absolutely not. And it just made me realize that we accept these deaths when there are so many easy ways to prevent it. We just need to stand up and do that. And so for the past 4.5 years, I've been trying to find out as much as I can about gun policy and our laws, and how can we strengthen them to make sure that not only does it not happen to my family and to communities like Sandy Hook, but that it doesn't happen in neighborhoods with predominantly people of color in Baltimore City and Chicago and Detroit and New Orleans, where it's happening every day, but their stories and their faces aren't on the news.
Right. So you're learning more about gun policy. You're becoming an advocate. How did you get involved with Action for Gun Sense in America, for Moms Demand Action? What led? How did you? Was that a group that you found? How did you find it?
So when I first found out, I was staying home from being an educator, from being a high school teacher, and I was home with my 2 children. And so I started looking around just the internet and trying to find out where can I get involved. Because I was a stay-at-home mom, I didn't have a lot of extra funds that I could contribute to the cause, but I thought, well, I have time. I can do something from home. I can take my kids with me down to Annapolis, down to DC. And right at about that exact same time, that's when Moms Demand Action was started. And they were having a call out for people to start chapters all across the country to build up this grassroots action. Right. And so I followed that call, and
While remaining a teacher?
No, so then I was already staying home with my kids. Okay. So at this point I had a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. Okay. So they were both really little.
You had a lot on your plate then.
I did. But I'm ambitious, so I started volunteering to go down to Annapolis and meet with legislators during the campaign of the 2013 Firearm Safety Act. I volunteered to go down to DC to meet with my legislators there. I started writing emails that would go out to different advocates all across Maryland and different mothers all across Maryland who were interested in this issue. And so I just started taking on more and more until I, that spring, became the chapter lead and started running that part of the organization in Maryland to try to organize in our own state of the types of laws that we could work as amateur activists on how to get that done.
So in 2013, there was a great success for liberal activists in favor of firearm regulation in passing legislation that actually went into effect in October 2013. Can you speak about your involvement in that legislative process and what actual components of the legislation were in there? And now that it's been a few times, now that a few years have elapsed, could you speak about the effectiveness and the impact that law has had?
Sure. At the time, I was working with Moms Spain Action, and that was actually one of the first meetings in my life that I'd had with my own delegate down in Annapolis. I worked very, very closely with Vinnie DeMarco, who at the time had just started Maryland Restraint Gun Violence. And both of these organizations worked to get people down to rallies, get folks down to testify at hearings, and we were successful, and that was passed. And some of the most important components of that, there is a piece where there's an assault weapons ban, there's a limitation on rounds in a magazine, no more than 10 in Maryland. There's a really important component, which doesn't get a lot of attention, so that the Maryland State Police has the power to regulate gun dealers. And if you are either a dealer or a person who owns a gun who has a gun lost and stolen, you have to report that within 72 hours. Because those lost and stolen guns, that's one way that guns are diverted to the underground market. And the foundation of the law deals with handgun purchaser licensing. And studies from the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research have shown that if you have to get a license, so if you have to take a safety course first, if you have to get fingerprinted, if you have to go to your local law enforcement and get a license before you purchase a handgun, in a study in Connecticut, it's shown to have a 40% reduction in homicides and a 15% decrease in suicides. And so we worked really hard to find policies that worked, evidence-based policies that we could fit into that bill to make sure that they didn't just sound good, but they could do good. And so we passed those major components, and of course they were implemented in October.
Right.
And then we started to see some numbers of homicides go down in that first year. Daniel Webster has started to see numbers of
Who is?
Daniel Webster is the director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. He's one of the leading experts on this issue across the country, and we were lucky enough to have him in Maryland. So at Marylanders from Gun Violence, we get to work very closely with him and his team. But what we started to see in Baltimore City was that there was a drop in if a gun was purchased in that first year, that there was a 75% reduction where there was then a straw purchase. So then it was diverted to someone else, then it was used in a crime. So we were starting to see these numbers. And of course, what keeps me up at night was, in early 2015, there was the tragedy with Freddie Gray, and, there was an uprising, which dealt with systemic police brutality.
Right.
And that violence created more violence. And so
with guns?
With guns.
Because he died from choking, right?
He did, but the violence that followed the uprising when after his death, because there were lots of new drugs that were out on the street, so there was lots more turf wars that were happening in Baltimore City. There was an uptick in violence in urban areas all across the country, and so that continued. So as what we've seen since 2015 is a tremendous amount of gun homicides in Baltimore City. I think in 2015 it was up to 344 homicides. About 300 of those were gun homicides. In 2016, there were about 300 homicides. About 90% of those were gun homicides. And then so far in 2017, there's been a shooting a day.
So gun rights advocates would say that if you define, or may say that if you define homicide as killing another person, right, then that may be okay. For instance, in times of war, on the battlefield, you can kill people and that's fine. Also, they might say that if somebody's invading your home, right, and committing theft or armed robbery or committing violent acts against you, threatening your life, then a gun advocate would say that's the precise situation in which you'd like to have a gun, use a gun, and kill another person, and you wouldn't be criminally liable if that was in your own home and they were attempting to kill you. So an increase in homicides may not necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, it's a bad thing, but from a gun rights perspective, it may be that, well, maybe these homicides are justifiable as defense, right? Do you have any numbers on the extent to which these homicides were committed by law-abiding citizens who are simply trying to protect their home and family?
I don't have numbers that any of these people would be trying to protect their home and family. And I think that most gun rights advocates would say that they are against this increase in gun violence too. I think that they would still call this gun violence. The difference becomes when someone would say, see, these laws don't work. That's where we differ. We have these strong laws in Maryland. Look at this uptick in crime. The Firearm Safety Act doesn't work. Maryland's strong gun laws don't work. I feel like that's where we differ in our arguments. And
so do gun rights advocates say, yes, we would like to reduce homicides by guns? Is that something that an NRA card-holding person would say?
Well, that is what they would say, but I think we have a clear difference in the foundation of how to accomplish that. A gun rights advocate would say, we need more guns. We need more guns so that we can protect themselves. Homicides. And that would reduce gun homicides because we could protect ourselves if someone is threatening us, threatening our family.
You would say?
And I would say, based on research and statistics and studies, that more guns do not make us safer. And if that were the case, then Baltimore would be one of the safest cities in the country, and it is not. How
many guns per capita are in Baltimore?
I don't know what the guns per capita is, but
there are a lot.
But yeah, well, yes. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, just last year, I believe the Baltimore Police Department confiscated about 1,800 guns used in crimes just that they were to get off the streets. So when we talk about why Maryland laws don't work or do work, I think it's also important to talk about the different types of gun violence. What we've talked about so far and what most people think of gun violence is going to be a gun homicide. There are about 11,000 gun homicides that happen in this country every year. There are over 20,000 gun suicides that happen every year. And not many people talk about gun suicides, that they happen. You know, not only are guns a taboo subject, but also suicide and mental health is a taboo subject. But the combination...
Would gun rights advocates say that suicide by guns is something we'd like to avoid?
I assume that they would say that, but then at the same time they would loosen every single gun policy or gun regulation that we would have in our country.
So okay.
So you can say one thing and fight for another.
How could you prevent a suicide? Right. So if somebody wants to kill themselves, they can throw themselves off a building. They can OD on drugs. They can do a lot of things to kill themselves.
But most people who commit suicide do that with a gun because it's so fatal. And what actually you find is that more women attempt suicide, but more women survive that attempt and do not attempt again because they don't use a gun. More men actually commit suicide because they use a gun. There are no second chances when it comes with a gun. And as I was saying before, that study with Connecticut, we didn't just see a drop in homicide, we saw a drop in gun suicide because so often a suicide can be an impulsive act. You have a person who is in crisis, who is suffering.
Depressed.
They're
and
feeling
they might
depressed.
Later regret feeling that.
And they might not even be in a deep, what we would call a diagnosis of a deep depression. You know, it may just be a time of crisis where their girlfriend just broke up with them. They're going through a divorce. They're suffering from alcohol abuse or a combination of these things. They just lost their job. So these could be crises that someone could overcome had a gun not been in the mix. So if you're contemplating suicide and you want to buy a gun, if you have to first take a safety course, if you have to first go to a local law enforcement and get
Are most
fingerprinted.
people who are trying to commit suicide with a gun, are they going out and purchasing a gun, or do they happen to have had a gun for 5 years and all of a sudden they decide to use it?
Well, perhaps they may try to go out and purchase it. I know there was a member that we work with, a volunteer, and her sister who committed suicide was living in Michigan, and she went to a gun show and purchased that in 8 minutes. So
committed suicide
soon after. And so I think we see both cases. Mm-hmm. I think that's why if you already do own a gun, it's important that we talk about educating gun owners on suicide and making sure. I know that there's a project that many gun owners and gun stores support, which is called Project Gun Safe. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. And so they try to have handouts and pamphlets in gun stores recommending that if you're going through a crisis, you can give it to a friend. Mm-hmm. The problem I see is, especially in a state like Maryland where it's illegal to transfer a handgun to someone else, how does a person suffering from suicide then transfer that if they're in crisis? And so one of the bills that we want to work on that would really help address suicide or someone who's going to be a danger to themselves or others would be a gun violence restraining order. So if you are a family member of someone or a close friend of someone, and you have a friend who you know already owns a gun, and they are in a crisis, and they've been talking about suicide, or they've been showing behaviors that makes you feel as though they're going to be a danger to themselves, then you could go to local law enforcement, you could petition the court, and then temporarily they could have those guns removed to keep them safe.
So, on the topic of licensing guns, gun rights advocates would potentially say that, the Second Amendment in the United States Constitution guarantees a right to bear arms, which was interpreted in the Heller v. D.C. Supreme Court case as an individual right, breaking historical precedent. Nevertheless, that is the law of the land today. So if the law of the land is that we have an individual right to bear arms, there is nothing in the Constitution that says we have an individual right to drive cars. So it may be appropriate to require someone to get a driver's license to use a car because there's no constitutional right to do so. But there is a constitutional right to bear arms, so it would be unconstitutional to get a driver's license, to get a gun ownership license in order to purchase a gun. How would you respond?
So also in Heller and D.C., there was a part of that argument where Antonin Scalia stated that you don't have the right to own what gun, a gun whatsoever, wheresoever, and whosoever. So even Antonin Scalia, a super conservative member of the Supreme Court, said that yes, you have an individual right to own this gun, but the government has a right to make sure that you are not a dangerous person. Right. You don't have the right to just carry it whatsoever, and that there are certain types of weaponry that maybe the average citizen shouldn't have. And that's been given to the different states to determine what those standards should be. And so to get a license, no one is saying that you can't have that handgun. What a license does is it ensures that it's not a dangerous person who is going to be gaining access to that firearm.
So what is the current process for obtaining firearms in Maryland? Because maybe some of our listeners aren't aware of that. Do you need a license currently?
So to get a handgun, or in Maryland, which we call a regulated firearm, you would have to get a handgun purchaser license. And I have one. I went through the process. I took the class. You apply online through the Maryland State Police. You don't even have to go to the Maryland State Police. You can apply online. It doesn't take very long. It's a $50 fee online. And then you apply or you find a gun safety organization. So you don't have to go through the Maryland State Police for that. You can find any gun store or gun instructor who would have a licensed class. Right. And so you go, and it's a 4-hour class. So I think I went on a Saturday for 4 hours. And you learn about Maryland's different laws. You learn a little bit about gun safety. So I had the opportunity to take apart a Glock and put it back together and learn how to clean it and be safe. And then after that 4 hours, then you go back to your online application. You submit the numbers. They have fingerprinting, but actually we did it right in the class. So you just pay directly to the instructor, and then they can do your fingerprints for you. And then once you get it, a receipt, you'll get it in the mail, and that'll say you are not a convicted felon, you don't have any disqualifying crimes, and then you submit those numbers to this online application. It takes a few weeks, and then you're going to get your little handgun purchaser license in the mail. You can take that to a gun dealer if you want to buy your handgun, and that's good for 10 years. So you have those initial costs in the beginning, but it's good for 10 years.
Is it a similar process with a long rifle?
So if you have a long rifle or if you have a shotgun, all you need is a standard NICS background check. So if you go to Walmart, if you go to Cabela's, if you go to Dick's Sporting Goods, you can go straight there for a long gun, and they'll do your minute long NICS background check before you do that. And the reason that we focus specifically on handguns is because the overwhelming majority of gun homicides and gun suicides are committed with handguns.
So it's harder to do a rifle that's 3 feet long.
Absolutely,
and
and handguns are easier to conceal. So if you're talking about urban gun violence, handguns are easier to have on the street. And so we were focused on trying to reduce gun violence. We weren't in 2013 trying to inconvenience hunters in the hunting community in Maryland as well. So we try to be smart about the policies that we put forth and the compromises that we're open to.
So just in terms of the effect of the 2013 law, of course, one thing that was noticed as a negative externality is that the law passed and was signed into law by the governor in May of 2013 by Governor Martin O'Malley, but it didn't go into effect until October 1st, 2013. In that period of time, Maryland saw a marked increase in the purchase of assault rifles around the state of Maryland, to people fearing that they wouldn't be able to purchase assault rifles after this went into effect. What was the effect of that on gun violence in Maryland, if any? And of course, you also said that you saw a decrease in homicides, and I wonder if any of your studies have been able to attribute the decrease in homicides to the actual law.
So in terms of the assault weapons that were purchased, and I know also there was a huge backlog of people trying to get to buy handguns before the handgun purchaser licensing went through. But that deals a lot with fear-mongering. You hear from the NRA, you hear from certain leaders who are in debt to the NRA, that we are going to take all of your guns. So you actually see an uptick in gun sales every time there's a mass shooting, sadly enough. And of course, there was the fear-mongering with President Obama. He's going to take your guns. So in certain instances, or certain executive actions that would happen, you would see an uptick. So that's pretty normal in terms of as different gun violence prevention measures are passed, with that fear-mongering right before that happens, you're going to be seeing an uptick in gun sales. In terms of the lower homicide, there weren't any studies that tried to connect them. So we can't say causatively the Firearm Safety Act reduced that, just like you can't say there's been an increase in Baltimore City, that's because of the Firearm Safety Act, or because it's not working. We just don't know. We're going to need a longer trend of about 10 years to see where that is going. And even if you talk to the Baltimore Police Department, the high rise in gun homicides that is happening is a huge anomaly. I mean, there was such a rise in 2015, and we're still trying to understand those reasons. Despite the law. But it's also important to remember that Maryland is not an island. I mean, our country is made up of a patchwork of a few states with strong laws and an overwhelming majority of states with very loose laws.
So a lot of guns in Baltimore came from other states with looser laws.
Yes, 62% of the guns used in crime in Baltimore City come from states with looser laws. They come from Pennsylvania and Virginia and West Virginia and Tennessee. And 44% of the guns used in crime across the state of Maryland come from those same areas. So we need laws on the federal level that are also going to keep guns being trafficked into Maryland and being placed into the underground market here. But that's not to say that there's something that we can't do, because there are still illegal gun transfers of handguns happening in the state of Maryland. There are still straw purchases that are happening. And so right now I'm working with the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research, and we're trying to increase the enforcement and the efficiency of that enforcement of illegal gun transfers here.
Right.
Because one of the problems that we're finding is that there was a court case that set precedents back in 2007. It was Chow versus the state of Maryland. And basically Chow said, no, I wasn't selling a gun, I wasn't transferring it, I was just loaning it, it was temporary. And the court realized that there was actually a loophole, and there's no definition under Maryland law as to what constitutes a transfer. And so he was acquitted. And you can see charts and studies done, or research done at least, that there's been an incredible drop in prosecutions of these illegal gun transfers. So these illegal private sales that are happening. And there's been a huge drop in those since 2007 because of this case.
And there's no registry of guns, right?
So in Maryland, if you have a regulated handgun, then yes, then the Maryland State Police does keep a registry. There's no national registry. There's no registry of long guns in Maryland. And a lot of gun rights advocates will say that a registry can be used for confiscation.
Right.
But the real aspect of that is that it's an incredible tool for law enforcement to make sure that they can track guns that are used in crimes. You can make sure that if someone is convicted of a domestic violence crime, or if someone has a domestic violence protective order out against them, then law enforcement can use that to make sure that they go and remove the guns from dangerous people. So there's, of course, a slippery slope fallacy.
And they actually aren't wrong, these NRA advocates who say that a gun registry would help law enforcement track down and confiscate guns, because if there were, as you're advocating for, a gun violence restraining order placed against you, in that case, a police officer would come to your house and remove your gun, and they would know that you had that gun. If there are different scenarios, if the where a police officer might confiscate a gun, right?
Well, we're talking about people who are a danger to themselves or others.
Right.
So right now, so that gun violence restraining order would be very similar to the process we have in Maryland for a domestic violence protective order.
Right.
So yes, if you have been shown to, dangerous to your wife and to your family, law enforcement can go remove that. But we're talking about dangerous people, and in terms of the gun violence restraining order, someone who could be a danger to themselves.
Right.
And so we have to keep a balance, because you can talk about an irrational fear of the government's going to use this to come and take your gun, but I would say let's talk about the rational fear of you getting shot, or you shooting yourself because you're going through that crisis. So I think we need to separate rational fear from irrational fear and make sure that we're passing laws.
So which is the greater threat? And you're saying there's a greater threat to public health faced by mass shootings, yes, or by a high frequency of individual shootings than there is the potential for a government to use a registry to confiscate the guns of people who are not actually dangerous to society.
Absolutely.
So we are nearing the end of the podcast. I'd like to ask you a final question. You're now in a leadership role as the president of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence. You are an advocate. You clearly are quite knowledgeable about firearm regulation in Maryland. I'd like to ask you to speak about public service, both in terms of your current position, but also as a mother, as a former high school teacher, and just speak for a minute to our listeners about why it is that you believe it's so important to try to improve our society for others, and what, at the end of the day, you hope you will have accomplished throughout your time in public service, throughout your life.
So I think especially right now, we're in a political climate where a lot of people who oppose policies in the Trump administration particularly are finding their advocacy feet. Mm-hmm. And I think that we are starting to realize, and what I had realized when I got involved 4.5 years ago, is that if we don't stand up for what's right and we don't stand up for what we believe in, no one else is going to do it. Mm-hmm. So often, we find our lives are busy, and we don't have time. We can't go to this meeting, or we can't go to this hearing. And we think, well, that's okay because someone else will do it. Mm-hmm. And I think we're at an important time in our politics where we are that people. We need to be the ones standing up for this. No one else is going to do it. It's going to come from grassroots movements in states all over the country on a number of different issues that people believe in. So it could be gun violence. It could be immigration. It could be Islamophobia. There are so many issues right now that are in danger, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. And it is our job, it is our responsibility as Americans to stand up and fight for what we believe in. And not just as advocates, but also as leaders. Run for office, start at the local level, build up to the state level. If people are unhappy with the leaders that we have on the national level, we need to start getting involved now.
And that has been Jen Pauliukonis, the president of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, a former legislative director for Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, the former Maryland chapter lead for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and a former high school educator who speaks about public service as a responsibility for all Americans to fight for what they believe in. In fact, Jen's perspective calls to mind a statement pertaining to the 20th century Holocaust during World War II, where someone said, first they came for the Jews, and I said nothing because I was not Jewish, and then they came for the gays, and I said nothing because I was not gay, and then they came for the Catholics, and I said nothing because I was not Catholic, and then they finally came for me, and there was nobody left to speak up for me. I may have gotten the quote a little bit wrong, but the point is that we're all in this together. And for Jen, public service and advocacy go hand in hand as a responsibility, not only to fight for this issue, which is important to her, gun violence prevention through firearm regulation and state law and federal law in Maryland, but she recognizes that we're all in this together, and there are many other issues that matter. Obviously, she's a mom, an educator, has interests in different policy areas across society, and it may not have been her child who was shot up in Connecticut, but she feels a responsibility to stand up for what she believes in, because if you wait until you become the victim, then it's too late. So for Jen, public service is all about standing up and taking responsibility for what you believe in society. Jen, I'd like to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And this has been episode 143 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. I'd like to remind you to subscribe at publicinterestpodcast.com, listen on iTunes, your podcast app, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Blueberry, Player FM, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Should you wish to leave a voicemail for Jen, you can call 240-630-0380, and that voicemail will be emailed to her, and she'll be able to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.